The freezing rain had been coming down sideways for 2 hours when I heard boots on my porch that weren't mine. I knew they weren't mine because mine were already off, dripping by the wood stove, and because nobody comes up the concession road to my place after dark in November unless their truck's in the ditch. I'd just put a pot of yesterday's chili back on the burner and was standing there in wool socks with a $40 balance in my checking account and a back that ached from a day of framing in the cold, and I figured it was Stan from down the road needing a boost again. I opened the door with the chili spoon still in my hand. It wasn't Stan, so the woman on my porch had the kind of coat you don't buy in Peterborough. Charcoal long, cut so clean it looked painted on, and not one drop of the sleet seemed willing to land on her. Her hair was pulled back so tight, it pained me to look at. She had heels on. Heels on my porch on a night when the steps were a sheet of glass and the hydro lines were sagging under ice. Behind her, idling in my laneway, was a black SUV with its wipers fighting a losing battle. I knew her face before she said a word. Everybody who reads a newspaper or scrolls a phone knew her face. Margot Renault. They'd run a profile on her the year before, a full spread, the surgeon they flew people across the country to see, the one who'd rebuilt a hockey player's chest after a snowmobile went through the ice. Chief of cardiac at the big hospital downtown in Toronto. The article had called her the most exacting woman in Canadian medicine, which I remember thinking was a polite way of saying nobody liked working for her. "Can I help you?" I said. The chili spoon was still in my hand. I felt like an idiot. She looked at me the way you'd look at a chair you were deciding whether to sit in. "You're Daniel Boyko." I didn't like how she said it, like she'd already filed me somewhere. "And you're standing on my porch in an ice storm in dress shoes, so I figure something's gone sideways for you tonight." She didn't smile. She reached into a leather bag and brought out a slim folder, the manila kind, and held it up between two fingers, like it was a piece of evidence in a trial. "I know a fair amount about you already," she said. 33. You frame and finish for Hutton Contracting, going on 6 years. You take side work restoring cedar canvas canoes out of the boathouse you rent on Cavendish Road. Your wife passed 3 years ago. You carry a line of credit at the credit union you're not making much of a dent in, and your furnace is on borrowed time. The sleet ticked against the gutters. I felt the cold get into a different part of me. You had somebody dig into my life. I had you assessed. Those are the same thing where I'm from. She didn't argue with that, and she didn't apologize for it either. She just stood there, dripping nothing, waiting for me to catch up to how reasonable she clearly thought all this was. And maybe that was the thing that got under my skin worse than the cold. Not that she'd had me looked into, but that she seemed genuinely puzzled I'd mind. "What do you want, Dr. Renault?" For half a second, something moved behind her eyes. Not softness, just a person, briefly, instead of a reputation. "I'd like to come inside," she said. "What I came to say shouldn't be said on a porch in this." Every sensible bone I had told me to say goodnight. A woman with that much money and that much polish does not drive 2 hours north on iced highways to a framer's farmhouse, unless she wants something she can't get cleaner. But my father, before the cancer took him, used to say, "You let a person in out of the weather first and decide what you think of them after." And she was standing there alone, soaked at the ankles, working so hard to look like she'd never needed anybody in her life. So I stepped back and held the door. My kitchen is small and honest. Scratched pine table I made myself, mugs in the sink, Rosie's grade 1 class photo still magneted to the fridge, because I've never once been able to take it down. Margot Renault sat at my table the way she probably sat at a boardroom, straight, hands folded, taking inventory without moving her head, the wood stove ticking, the smell of chili, my work coat over the back of the other chair. I put a glass of water in front of her because I didn't have anything fancier, and I wasn't about to pretend I did. "Talk," I said. She opened the folder. Her voice stayed level, but it cost her something to keep it there. "I want a child," she said, "and after a great deal of consideration, I believe you're the most suitable man to help me have one." I sat down across from her. I think I laughed, one short ugly sound. "Pardon me?" "I'm 41. 2 years ago I was treated for ovarian cancer. I'm in remission. The treatment that saved my life took most of my window with it. I have 1 round of viable embryos left and a body that may or may not cooperate. I've looked at this every way a person can look at a thing." She slid the folder an inch toward me. "I've reviewed donors. I've reviewed clinics, but for reasons I can explain, I'd prefer a known father. Someone of sound health and sound character, with no interest in disrupting the child's life or mine. I'm prepared to compensate you generously. Lawyers on both sides. You'd have no obligation you didn't want. I only need. I put my hand up. Stop. Dude. She stopped. I looked at her for a long moment. The ice was loud on the windows now. This woman could have bought my whole township and not noticed the dent in her account, and here she sat in my kitchen describing the making of a human being like she was sourcing a part. You drove up here, I said slowly. You paid somebody to go through my life. My wife, my debts, my furnace. And then you sat down at my table and offered to buy a piece of me. I didn't use the word buy. I stood and walked to the door and opened it, just enough that the cold came in around our ankles. That's the only word for it, doctor. You can dress it up with lawyers, but that's the deal you drove here to make. I held the door. I'm not selling myself. I'm not selling my blood. And I'm sure as hell not selling some kid who might come from me to a woman who'll write him into a contract before he's even a heartbeat. She didn't flinch the way I wanted her to. She closed the folder. She stood, smoothed her coat, every motion exact. But there was a hairline somewhere in the polish that hadn't been there a minute ago. At the door she paused. Most people, she said, want to know why I chose them. I got chosen once, I said. By a woman who's gone now. Being chosen doesn't mean you get to keep anything. That landed somewhere. I watched it land. Then she stepped out into the freezing rain, picked her way down my glassy steps in those ridiculous heels without once reaching for the railing, and got into the SUV, and the red taillights went smearing off down the concession road into the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I kept seeing her face at the door. Not hurt, exactly. Margot Renault didn't do hurt where you could see it. But I'd seen something in her I recognized, and that was the trouble. I'd seen it in my own bathroom mirror the winter after Rosie died, the look of a person who's gotten so good at being alone they've forgotten how to ask for a single thing like a regular human being would. And that scared me more than the folder had. Principal, I should tell you about Rosie or none of the rest of this will make sense. Rosalind Boyko taught grade 1 at the public school in town and played fiddle at the Legion most Friday nights, and was, without question, the loudest and best thing that ever happened. To me. She sang the words to songs wrong on purpose to make me crazy. She left her socks in every room of the house like she was marking territory. She cried at the back half of movies she'd spent the first half calling garbage. We were going to grow old and broke and happy in this farmhouse. That was the whole plan. And then on a Tuesday morning 3 Octobers back, she stood up from the breakfast table to refill her tea, and an aneurysm nobody knew she carried went off in her head like a circuit blowing, and she was gone before the kettle finished. No accident I could be angry at. No long goodbye. Just a normal Tuesday with a hole punched through the middle of it that never closed. People kept telling me I was young, that there was time. They were wrong about time. When the person you were going to grow old with disappears between one sip and the next, time stops meaning what it used to. 3 days after the ice storm, I came out of the framing job in town, and there was the black SUV across the street from the lumberyard, window down a few inches. Margot Renaud's face in the gap, watching, not calling out. I crossed the road, 2x4s still on my shoulder. You planning to sit there till somebody phones the OPP about a vehicle casing a construction worker? I wasn't sure you'd speak to me, she said. No folder this time. I'm speaking now. She was quiet a beat. When she spoke, it cost her more than anything she'd said the first night. I owe you an apology. The way I came to your house was cold, insulting. I treated a human matter like a procurement file, and I understand why you put me out in the rain. I set the lumber down against the truck. I'm not angry that you want a kid, I said. I'm angry you turned a kid that doesn't exist yet into a project. You're right. Coming out of Margot Renaud, those 2 words sounded like a stone going into still water. Clean, heavy. Not at all easy for her. I studied her through the gap in the window. This was not a woman who apologized. This was not a woman who'd ever spent much time on the losing end of anything, but she'd driven 2 hours up the 28 to do it. I don't know why I said what I said next. You eaten? She frowned like the question didn't fit any scenario she'd prepped for. No. I've got chili and not much else. No wine, no cloth napkins, no candles. But if you want to talk to me like a person instead of a candidate, you can come eat. No folder, no money, no lawyers. She looked at me through the glass for a long moment. Then she said, all right. She came by at 7. No driver, no fancy coat. Just a plain dark sweater and a paper bag from a roaster in the city with good coffee in it, the kind I'd never buy myself. She set it on the table like she didn't know where else to put it. I didn't know what to bring. Coffee beats a folder, I said, and the corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile. Close. That first dinner was nothing. Chili, bread I burned a little, the coffee after. She sat at my table not knowing what to do with her hands without a laptop or a chart in front of them. She looked at my kitchen longer than she looked at the food. The wood stove, the canoe paddle I'd hung over the door, Rosie's class photo on the fridge. She didn't ask about it. I'll give her that. She knew enough not to. She came back the next week. Not to talk me into anything. She brought 2 cups from Tim Hortons and an old book on wood canvas canoe construction. She said she'd come across, which I doubted, and she sat on my porch on a cold, bright Saturday morning and asked about the 17-foot chestnut I had clamped up in the boathouse. I told her about steaming the ribs, about the difference between filling a canvas and just painting it, about why the cedar has to be quarter sawn. She listened harder than any paying customer I'd ever had. Then she came again the Saturday after that, and the one after that. Nothing dramatic, just regular enough that the house started knowing the sound of her car coming up the concession. And that, of course, was the problem. I was getting used to it. The months that came after, Margot Renault worked her way into my life in ways I never planned and couldn't quite stop. Coffee on the porch turned into the odd dinner. Dinner turned into her parking herself at my kitchen table with her laptop open, reviewing patient files and surgical schedules while I sanded a gunwale or fitted a thwart. I started noticing things about her. She could run an operating theater with 40 people in it and never raise her voice. But she had no idea what to do when the chili boiled over on my stove. She could talk a hospital board into 8 figures of equipment, and then stand there genuinely defeated by my temperamental old percolator. She could quiet a room with one look, and then I'd catch her standing too long in front of Rosie's photo on the fridge, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to look at it. One night, I made my late mother's borscht, which is a whole afternoon of work, and Margot stayed to help with the dishes. She was bad at it. First plate still had soap on it when she set it in the rack. I just rinsed it again without a word. She caught me. You can tell me I'm doing it wrong. I'm trying not to turn dish duty into a performance review. She went still, and then she laughed. A short, startled sound, like even she hadn't known it was still in there. That laugh did something to me I wasn't ready for. I started wanting to hear it again. That was a problem too. Another evening she asked about Rosie, carefully. You don't have to, she said, but I'd like to know who she was. Oh, I told her. The fiddle at the Legion, the wrong song lyrics, the socks, the crying at bad movies, the way she'd haul me up off the couch to dance in the kitchen when neither of us could dance worth anything. Margot listened all the way through without interrupting once. When I finished, she said quietly, "She sounds like someone worth carrying." She was, I said. I carry her every day. She didn't try to compete with a dead woman. She didn't tell me it was time to move on. She didn't say one of the empty things people had been handing me at the grocery store for 3 years. That alone set her apart from nearly everyone who'd tried to help. It was a long while before she let me see her own cracks. It came out one night over the dishes again, in February, with the wind howling around the eaves. She told me about the cancer, but not the part the magazine printed. The real part. There were about 3 weeks, she said, drying the same plate she'd already dried, where I wasn't sure I wanted to keep going. I stopped wiping the counter. I don't mean the prognosis. The prognosis was good, they kept telling me. I mean, she set the plate down. She looked at her own hands, the hands that had been inside hundreds of chests. My whole life I built things that looked like control. My schedule, my reputation, my body, even. I ran, I ate clean, I slept on a system. And then they found something in me I couldn't cut out myself. And suddenly other people were deciding when I could eat, when I could stand, whether I'd ever carry a child. I lay in that room and realized I'd built a life that nobody needed to sit in with me. My team sent a very nice arrangement of flowers. Nobody stayed past visiting hours, because I'd never once let them. The wind shook the windows. So I decided, she went on, that if I was going to keep living, I needed a reason that wasn't the hospital. Something that wasn't a quarterly outcome or my name on a paper. Something that was only mine. And I'm a person who solves problems. So I made a plan. I built a file. I found candidates. She finally looked at me, and I drove up the 28 in an ice storm and stood on your porch and offered to buy what I should have had the courage to ask for like a human being. I didn't rush to comfort her. I sat down at the table across from her. Margot, You're not wrong for wanting a kid. You're wrong for thinking you could engineer your way into a family. I know, she said. I'm learning. That sentence undid more of me than I wanted it to. We had our first real fight on a black cold night in March. I came home from the job and there was an envelope on my kitchen table from a woodworking school in the city, one of those high-end fine furniture programs that cost more than my truck, telling me my enrollment was confirmed and my full tuition had been sponsored by Dr. M. Renault, and that, by the way, she'd already been in touch with my landlord about the boathouse lease. I called her right then. You signed me up for a school, and you called my landlord, without asking me a single thing. A pause. I was going to tell you tonight. After it was already done. Daniel, you have real talent. You shouldn't be a laborer your whole life if you don't have to be. Stop. I cut her clean off. The line went quiet. I'm not a project of yours. While I could hear her breathing. You did this, I said lower now, because you're scared. You see something you care about, and you reach straight for money and a plan and a lawyer to nail it down so it can't get away from you. But I'm not a company you can buy out. I'm not a thing that needs fixing, and if you want to be in my life, you have to ask me. You don't get to decide for me and call it kindness. She didn't fight it. That took the wind out of my anger, but the hurt sat where it was. After a long while, her voice came back different. You're right. I know I'm right. I'm sorry. I saw a road I thought you'd want, and a breath. I paved it before I asked if you wanted to walk it. You can't love a person by managing their life, Margot. The line stayed quiet for a long time. Then she said, so softly I almost lost it under the furnace. I don't know how to not hold on with both hands when I'm afraid of losing something. I leaned my head against the cold window. Then learn, I said, but learn by asking first. And she did. Not perfectly. But honestly, she started texting instead of just appearing. Would you want company tonight instead of headlights in the lane? Do you want my opinion or do you just want me to listen? Before she gave it. She was still Margot, still sharp enough to make me want to put my head through the drywall some days. But now there was a door left open in every sentence, a place for me to choose. And it was that, more than anything, that started me trusting her. I figured out I loved her on a completely ordinary morning. I'd come down with something after 3 days of framing in cold rain and was good for nothing. She showed up at 7, but she didn't force her way in this time. She texted from the porch. I'm at your door with soup and cold medicine. If you want me in, open it. I read it half feverish and half longing and got up and opened the door. She came in with a bag from the pharmacy and soup from the diner in town and a look on her face like she was about to manage a code in the ICU. She took my temperature, made me drink water, parked me on the couch under Rosie's old quilt, and then she sat at my kitchen table and worked. When I surfaced near noon, she was still there, one hand answering email, the other quietly sliding a fresh glass of water within my reach without making a thing of it. I lay there and watched her, and I knew. It wasn't the kind of knowing that knocks you over. It was quiet, certain. I love this woman, and right behind it, the fear that I was about to open the house that had been Rosie's to somebody new, and I had to be sure. Sure she loved me, and not just the warmth of a kitchen that wasn't a glass tower downtown. Sure she could actually live in the ordinary. Burnt toast. Hydro bills. The wood stove that needs feeding at 3 in the morning. Days where nothing needs optimizing except sitting next to each other while the snow comes down. The answer came in another argument, which I'm starting to think is just how Margot and I find the truth. She was at my table telling me I should bid on bigger contracts, go after a foreman job, stop spending my evenings on canoes that paid in handshakes. Your time is worth more than that, she said. Not everything needs to be made worth more, Margot. I completely disagree. I put down the bread knife. I know. That's exactly what worries me. She went still. What's that supposed to mean? I tried to say it gently, because I wasn't trying to wound her, I was just tired. It means you look at something good and right away you want to make it bigger, safer, more efficient. But some things you just leave alone. A regular supper, a regular job. A man fixing old canoes in a boathouse because it's the 1 hour all week his head goes quiet. I looked at her. You don't need to turn me into a better version of myself to be allowed to love me. That hit something deep. She looked down at the table. Both hands lay flat on the pine, not gripping, not steering anything. When she spoke, she didn't sound like the most exacting woman in Canadian medicine. I don't know how to look at something I love without trying to make it safer. I sat down across from her. The things I love have a way of disappearing, she said, and for the first time she let me see the whole of it. My father walked out when I was 9. My sister, who I half-raised, died of an overdose at 26 while I was in my residency saving strangers. Then the cancer. Every time I told myself if I just held on tighter, controlled more, I could have stopped it. So I held on tighter: the career, the schedule, my body, the people I let close, which was almost nobody. She lifted her eyes. They were red, but she didn't cry. I'm not afraid of being alone, Daniel. I'm good at alone. I'm afraid of this. I'm afraid of having you. Of wanting to sit at this ugly little table next week and next year, and then waking up one morning and it's gone like all the rest. My chest ached in a way I knew too well. I can't promise you won't lose anything, I said. Then how did you do it? How did you let yourself love somebody again after her? I was quiet a long time, then I told her the truth. Because Rosie would skin me alive if I used her dying as an excuse to turn the rest of my life into a locked room. And because some things are worth the risk of losing twice. She looked at me like I'd walked her to the edge of a cliff, and was also the only hand reaching out over it. You're making me say it, she said. I'm not making you do anything. You just sit there being you, and it's almost the same as being forced. She said it half furious at her own helplessness, and I couldn't help the laugh that got out of me. She glared, and then she said it. I love you. It's deeply inconvenient, and I want that on the record. I love you too, I said. Have for a while now. Her face changed. Not a triumphant look. The look of somebody finally allowed to set down a weight they didn't know they'd been carrying. Got married the next September, a little less than a year after the night she came up my steps in those heels. Not in a hotel. She showed me a list of venues once that nearly put me on the floor just from the prices. And I gave her the look she'd come to understand meant not a chance, and she closed her laptop and asked where I wanted it. I said the backyard, under the old maple, with the lake just down the slope. She looked at me a moment and then she smiled. Of course, the backyard. Fewer than 30 people came. My mother, before she passed the following winter, a few of the boys from Hutton's, the minister from the United Church in town, Stan from down the road, Mrs. Beaulieu, who Rosie used to drive to her appointments and who I'd just kept driving. A couple of Margot's residents who, it turned out, would have walked through fire for her and just never knew she'd let them close enough to find out. She wore a plain dress and no jewelry and walked across the grass on her own 2 feet, slow and deliberate, choosing every step. When she reached me, she whispered, I am not going to cry. I believe you. You're looking at me like you know I will. I don't know anything more than you do, I said. I just know it the same second you do. She bit her lip. Her eyes shone. And then she laughed instead, and that was better than crying anyway. The months after were the quietest I'd known since I lost Rosie, not empty quiet. The kind where a house finally finds a new rhythm and settles into it. Margot still ran her department, but she guarded the hours between 5 and 8 at night, like an operating room. Nobody was allowed to scrub into late. She was there when the furnace finally gave out for good and we put in the new one. She was there when I worked up the nerve to bid on a foreman's spot at Hutton's and got it, after years of being too scared to try. When I told her, she just said, Of course you did. You can't even pretend to be surprised for me? I'm not good at pretending to be stupid. And then came the call, in January, in the dead heart of winter. I came in from plowing the lane and found her sitting in the front room, perfectly still, her phone face down on her knee. I've spent enough years around grief to know what that kind of stillness means. I went and sat across from her. The clinic called, she said, in the level voice she used for the worst things. The transfer didn't take. There aren't any more. She's not recommending we try again. I didn't say it's okay because it wasn't. I didn't say we still have each other because in that minute the words seemed too thin to lay over what she was feeling. I just sat with her. After a long time she said, I knew the odds were poor. I had the numbers. But when it becomes the final answer, the numbers feel different. Yeah, I said. They do. I feel like I failed, she said lower. I know that's not rational. This is biology, not a result I can study harder for. But I feel it. I took her hand. You didn't fail. Your body survived a cancer that should have killed you. It got cut and poisoned and dragged back from the edge and it kept you here. It didn't betray you. It just went a different way than the plan. She looked at me. Our plan? Yeah, I said. Ours. And then she cried, finally, all the way, without trying once to hide it. A few weeks later, there was a folder on the kitchen table again. Not like the first one. Nothing in it meant to pressure anybody into signing anything. Just information about adoption, specifically about the kids who are hardest to place, the ones with medical files, with histories, the ones who've been sent back more than once. I read it through and looked up at her. You want to adopt. She sat across from me, both hands flat on the table, not gripping anything. I want us to think about it, not tonight. Not because I need to replace what we lost, but because there are kids out there waiting for somebody who won't look at them like a problem to be solved. She almost smiled. I'd know something about that. I looked at the woman who'd once stood on my porch with a file, trying to buy a shortcut to a family, and who was now sitting at the same table just leaving a door open and letting me decide whether to walk through it. Then let's look into it, I said. That spring we met a boy named Jonah. He was 6 years old. He'd been born with a heart that wasn't built right. 2 surgeries before his 4th birthday, a long scar down the middle of his chest that he'd show you only if he decided he trusted you, which according to his file he almost never did. He'd been in care since he was 2, returned twice, and somewhere in all of that he'd simply stopped talking. Not deaf, not unable. He just decided the world hadn't earned his words yet, and who could blame him? The social worker, a kind woman named Priya, warned us he was cautious with strangers. He didn't run to you. He didn't hug. The first time he sat in the corner of the visiting room with a battered stuffed beaver clamped under one arm, watching all of us with these flat dark eyes, measuring who'd leave first. I sat down on the floor a good distance off and didn't reach for him. Margot took a chair near the door. She didn't call him over. She didn't get falsely sweet about it. She just stayed there, quiet and plain, present without pushing. Jonah looked at me. Then he looked at her, a long time. Then he stood up, the beaver dangling, and walked slowly over to her chair. He studied her flat shoes and her folded hands and her face. Then he reached out and touched the cuff of her sleeve. Hi there, Margot said, so quietly I barely caught it. He didn't say anything. He looked at her chest, where a person's heart is, like he could tell somehow that she'd spent her whole life on the inside of hearts like his. Then he lifted both arms straight up, which is a thing that needs no words in any language on earth. Pick me up. Margot looked at me over the top of his head. There was a question in her face too big to say. I nodded. She lifted him and he put his head down on her shoulder like he'd walked an awfully long way and finally found somewhere to set the weight down. I had to turn and look at the wall for a second. Jonah came home in the fall with a small duffel bag, a pair of new boots, a heart monitor app on Margot's phone she checked about 40 times a day until she made herself stop, and eyes that were still careful. Margot, who could read an echocardiogram in her sleep, taught herself how a 6-year-old likes his toast cut and which beaver had to be in the bed before the lights went out. I was slower at the whole thing, clumsier. But Jonah didn't seem to hold it against me. He'd just watch and wait while I figured it out. He still didn't talk, not at first. But one evening near the end of October, the 3 of us were at that same pine table. The table where I'd once put Margot out in the rain, where she'd told me about the 3 weeks she didn't want to live, where we'd fought and made up and laid an adoption folder down like a question. And Jonah was working his way through a grilled cheese, and out the window the first real snow of the year started coming down. He pointed at it. And then, so quiet you'd have missed it if the furnace had been running, he said one word. Snow. Margot's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She didn't lunge at it. She didn't make it into a thing he'd have to perform again. She just looked out the window with him and nodded and signed in her plain way, yes, snow, and went back to her supper like a person whose whole chest hadn't just been split open and stitched back together better than it was before. That night, after he was asleep with the beaver, Margot and I sat at the table. My chipped mug was on the counter, the one that says "World's Okayest Carpenter," which she'd once threatened to replace and now just turned slowly in her hands. Do you know what I keep thinking about? She said. Tell me. The first night. I had the whole thing built in my head before I knocked. The file, the terms, the contract, the candidate. She glanced down the hall toward the soft glow under Jonah's door. I thought I was driving up here to find a way to have a child. She looked at me. Turns out I was driving up here to learn how to be somebody's mother. I put my hand over hers, and I thought I was opening the door on a problem. So what am I, in the end? She said. I looked around, at the kitchen, at the hallway, at the snow going past the window, at the woman who'd made my life bigger than the size of my grief. You're home, I said. From down the hall, in his sleep, Jonah laughed at something, A small, surprise sound, bright as anything, and we both turned toward it at the exact same second. No folder could have planned that. No lawyer could have drawn up the terms for it. No amount of money on earth could have bought the sound of a kid nobody else wanted, finally laughing in his sleep, in a house where not one person sees him as a problem. I used to think my life ended on a Tuesday morning over a cup of tea. Margot used to think family was something you could acquire if you just built the right plan. Jonah used to think a home was just a place people leave you in. We were all three of us wrong about that. A home isn't a thing that comes built right from the start. It's the thing three broken people put together with their own hands, in the cold, one supper and one snowfall and one ordinary night of staying at a time. I've gone back to that first night more times than I can count, me in wool socks with a chili spoon in my hand, a stranger in a soaked coat on my porch, offering to buy a piece of my future. For a long while I told myself the whole thing came down to luck. It didn't. Looking back, every good thing that grew out of it. Margot at my table on a Saturday morning, the wedding under the maple, Jonah pointing at the window and finally saying, "Snow." All of it traces back to one small refusal. I said no when she slid that folder across the table. Not because I was proud, but because there are lines you don't cross even with $40 in your account and a furnace on its last winter. If I'd signed, there'd have been no marriage and no boy asleep down the hall. The life I have now hangs off the plain fact that I held my own word above my own comfort, and I've come to believe the way a person acts when there's money on the table is the truest thing you'll ever learn about them. But keeping my hands clean was never going to be enough on its own. I had to use my head, too. The folder was an insult, sure, but I made myself look past it to the woman holding it, and what I saw wasn't a cold operator. It was somebody who'd gotten so good at being alone she'd forgotten how to ask for one ordinary thing. Reading that right is what let me open the door a second time. And later, when she signed me up for that school without asking, and I wanted to be done with her, the smart thing wasn't to blow it all up. It was to tell her the difference between loving somebody and trying to control them, and then to give her room to learn it. Slowing down long enough to understand a person before you judge them has cost me a lot less than the times I didn't. And none of it would have held without the hardest part, the staying. After I lost Rosie, getting up every morning was its own kind of work, and there were stretches I didn't manage it well. But you keep going anyway. Margot survived a cancer that should have taken her. We both sat through that January phone call when the clinic told us there'd be no baby of our own, and we got up the next day and looked at the kids nobody else wanted. That's the thing I'd hand to my own son if I could hand him only one. The world will knock the legs out from under you. And the only answer that's ever worked is to stand back up and try again. Gentler this time. Daniel, Margot, Jonah. 3 people who got broken in 3 different ways, learning supper by supper that a home is just what you build out of the wreck if you're brave enough to keep showing up.